This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Good evening, everyone. Our format tonight will be the same as it was last week. Immediately following Professor Browne's presentation, we'll assemble into a panel up here on the stage with Professor Browne, our two discussants this evening, whom I'll introduce briefly at that point, with myself as moderator. We'll invite your questions for all the panel members, but please use the mics in the aisles. You'll notice that they're closer to the front this time, which will help in a number of ways. Be sure to use the mic, and please limit your question to a maximum of 1 minute. Last week, we welcomed to class Dr. Eugenie Scott, the director of the National Center for Science Education, who spoke on the topic of science and religion, probably not what you think, unquote. Looking back over her talk and the delightful lunch that followed on Tuesday, it was lively and fun, and I encourage you to take advantage of these lunch opportunities. I would say that Dr. Scott made 4 main points worth a few minutes review tonight. Her first point was that science as a way of knowing the natural world has 2 special properties, 2 key properties that distinguish it from other ways of knowing. The explanations of science use only natural processes and natural phenomena, and they only help us understand the natural world, was her first point. So it's using natural processes and natural phenomena to understand the natural world, point 1. Point 2 is equally important. Science constantly tests itself against the natural world. It's a self-correcting system of knowledge on the basis of empirical observation and feedback. Professor Scott offered some diagrams of other ways of knowing, such as personal insight and authority, that stood as counterpoints or foils to science, causing some controversy by leaving out other ways of knowing from philosophy, literature, and the humanities, as our humanities discussant was fond of pointing out. Her point, however, I think, was not a user's guide to all major epistemologies, though one might have thought so. Her point was rather to highlight the special properties of science and to emphasize that science is limited to the realm of natural phenomena. It cannot do everything for everybody. It uses natural phenomena to explain nature. Second point would be that Dr. Scott emphasized that science, including evolutionary science, is based on methodological materialism in its relentless search for natural causes. But she emphasized that methodological materialism is not the same as philosophical materialism, which she described as a general godless worldview based on, quote, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. She offered the work of the Austrian monk Gregor Mendel, discoverer of particulate inheritance. You remember the pea pod breeding experiments in then Austria, as an example of a methodological materialist who was obviously not a philosophical materialist. So her second key point was that one need not be a philosophical materialist in order to be an evolutionist or other scientist, and thus be a proponent of materialist explanations for natural phenomena. The two are different. You can be an M&M, a methodological materialist, without being a materialist philosopher. She thus insisted that science is a method, a substratum, she called it, available to various ideologies, available to support a number of different political views. Her third point, the whole domain that science doesn't touch, said Dr. Scott, is that set of rules and beliefs that people have about a non-material reality, a reality that exists for at least some members of all human societies ever studied. Eugenie defined religion as this domain of rules and beliefs that people have about a non-material reality, this reality of supernatural phenomena. Problems arise, she said, when thinkers and writers give supernatural explanations for natural phenomena, and this leads right to the religion versus science clash. Her third point, however, was that this is not a dichotomy, religion versus science, but a continuum of positions on the matter, leading from creationism to evolution. On the one end, at one pole, is special creation, and at the other end is evolution. And in between, one finds, she showed us, flat earthers, geocentrism, young earth creationism, old earth creationism, theistic evolution, and finally atheistic evolution. Her last point, Dr. Scott concluded that science does not compel a position on religion or a belief in a non-material reality or not. She took the contrasting positions of well-known and widely respected biologists to make her point. On the one hand is Richard Dawkins, evolutionist, philosophical materialist, and author of the book The God Delusion. On the other hand, Francis Collins, leader of the Human Genome Project, author of the book The Language of God, A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. Both are scientists whose career-long pursuit of understanding the natural world fueled radically divergent positions in religious views. Hence, Dr. Scott's point, science does not compel any particular position on religion. It's interesting to reflect back on this whole contested domain, science versus religion, and to recognize that the person that set it all into play, Charles Robert Darwin, carefully, quote, sidestepped any debate about a divine presence in the natural world, quoting from our speaker tonight and our delightful reading, her book, Darwin's Origin of Species, a Biography, on page 76. Says Browne, Darwin purposely avoided the topic of the origin of life, but was careful not to allow the creator any active role in subsequent biological proceedings, unquote. It is altogether fitting and appropriate that we roll back to the source tonight and take a closer look at where it all began with Darwin's On the Origin of Species. And who more fitting to get us going than Darwin's leading biographer, Professor Janet Browne, the Aramont Professor of the History of Science at Harvard. Janet Browne's interests range widely over the history of the life sciences and natural history. After a first degree in zoology, she studied for a PhD in the history of science at Imperial College London, and later published that work as The Secular Arc, Studies in the History of Biogeography, fascinating field. Ever since then, she has specialized in reassessing Darwin's work, first as associate editor of the early volumes of the Correspondence of Charles Darwin, the amassed body of correspondence that we have from his records, and more recently as the author of a major biographical study that integrated Darwin's science with his life and times. While framed as a biographical study, Dr. Browne's intention was to explore the ways in which scientific knowledge was created, distributed, and accepted or not, moving from private to public as reflected in the two-volume structure of her biography. The biography has been well received in both the United States and the UK and was awarded several prizes, including the James Tate Black Award for Nonfiction in 2004, the Heinemann Prize from the Royal Literary Society, and the Pfizer Prize from the History of Science Society. Prior to moving to the History of Science department at Harvard, she was for a number of years at the Wellcome Trust Center for the History of Medicine at University College London, where she taught about the history of science, biology, and medicine. She has been editor of the British Journal for the History of Science, president of the British Society for the History of Science. She's working on new courses all the time, including one called Bringing Nature Indoors, Museums, Laboratories, and the Field. Her website says she is currently working on visual and cultural history of the gorilla. This winter, Professor Browne will join Professor David Abernethy and myself as faculty leaders of the Voyage of the Beagle trip from the Stanford Alumni Association that Dean Junkerman spoke about opening night. The trip begins here at Stanford and winds up in London a few days before Darwin's 200th birthday celebration. What a lovely way to greet and meet Janet Browne. Welcome, Janet.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you to all the organizers who have invited me to be here tonight, and thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to meet you, and I hope we meet more of you, or at least some of you, perhaps not all of you, tomorrow at lunchtime. Okay, thanks. Now, I'm afraid we're going to move from the metaphysics of science and religion right down in there amongst the real world of history. And I want to start by, of course, reminding you that Darwin's impact on the Western world, on the globe, in the last 150 years has been utterly undeniable. In the modern day, if we look around us at the ways in which Darwin's name and Darwin's reputation have come to be very significant forces, we can see that there are very many places, institutions, and objects that carry something of his aura. There's a university named after Darwin in Northern Australia, of which this is an image. There's a rather fancy programming system named after Darwin, of which this is an image. There's a rock band named after Darwin in Europe. There are all kinds of ways of calling on Darwin to advertise your wares. There's foodstuffs. This is a very potent beer that's available in Cambridge, UK, named after Darwin. There's, of course, the Darwin Awards that the biologists amongst us will know celebrate the unfortunate results of natural selection in the human world. There are a zillion ways of referring to Darwin humorously and to the evolutionary story. It's become embedded in our modern consciousness that we are the end result. We may not be the final result, but we are the end result of a sequence of evolutionary changes that is alluded to in many, many different formats and in many, many different ways. Here is a postcard deriving from or playing with the hominid succession, and the man in the suit at the end is asking, are we nearly there yet? Many other variants of this theme. Oops. Sorry. And I hope this is going to work. Yes, there's a little moving image too. And for those of us who have been visiting Europe more recently, you'll know that the image of Darwin appears on the English £10 note. He's been there for quite some time. He came up on in the year 2002, and the Treasury, in the most recent communication I've had, says that he'll stay there through next year, through Darwin's celebratory year 2009, and then they're going to pull him off. And we don't know who's going to be on after that. And most obviously, and we'll be talking about this in future classes, there are the current debates in North America, other places in the world, between creationists and evolutionists that I have found in Massachusetts is rather interestingly manifested in car fenders. Here we have a Massachusetts Darwin supporter. Further south in Georgia, one can express one's alternative view with the fossils say no. Evolution is a fairy tale for grown-ups. And right down at the bottom, God bless America. So there's many ways in which Darwin is a living phenomenon today. And what I wanted to do was to try and take us backwards, take us back to 1859, to think about some of the comparable impact that he had in his own day. And my hope is to reflect on Darwin's achievement as it was regarded in his own time, and to provide some of the historical context for your analysis through the rest of the term. You probably call it a semester. Through the rest of your series, for your analysis of his continuing impact. And we could spend weeks doing this. The history is terribly rich. And I should warn you that when Darwin scholars get going on some of their more knotty problems, they really don't let go. The manuscripts are tremendously alluring, the issues are very intricate, and we rarely return to the real world. We're tremendously lucky as historians to have such a complete collection of Darwin's private papers, his working library, his notebooks, and his correspondence, mostly in Cambridge in the United Kingdom, but also in North America, predominantly in the American Philosophical Society. But my theme tonight really is not these localized manuscripts, or even Darwin as a local phenomenon, but that his book became universal, that it's a global phenomenon. It's a truly stunning achievement. And here is a very remarkable chalk portrait of Darwin. It was taken by the artist Samuel Lawrence in 1853, which is 6 years before he published The Origin of Species. Shows a very powerful face, thoughtful, and I think determined. So I want to fill in a little background, take a quick look at the book itself, at the contents of The Origin of Species, and then discuss some of the main elements of its controversial reception in the Victorian context. And I want to take you back to early Victorian Britain, where we can see the increasing effects of the Industrial Revolution. When Darwin arrived home from the Beagle Voyage in 1836, the country was very different from when he left. It was becoming mechanized, industrialized, with a diversifying economy, and many entrepreneurial manufacturers, of whom one was his uncle and his grandfather, Josiah Wedgwood, the pottery magnate. Darwin, on his return from the Beagle, would have seen trains, perhaps not as glamorous as this Turner painting, but certainly trains, railroads, power looms, factories and mills, newspapers, and many of the apparatus of the modern world, or much of the apparatus of the modern world, was emerging. There was rising literacy, there was the start of organized mail services. The corners of the country that he was living and working in seemed much less far away than they had been at the beginning of the century. And also it was the beginnings of empire. When the political instabilities of the 1830s and 1840s were fading and giving rise to gradual reform in voting rights, Britain was not a democracy at that point, property rights, most of the land was still owned by the aristocrats, and many other social reforms. This all came to a peak, as most Victorianists like to think, in the Great Exhibition held in London in a wonderful Crystal Palace, a great big glass greenhouse in 1851 that was designed to showcase the achievements of the many different countries of the world. There was marked social change as well, and this did in many ways help the reception of The Origin of Species. There was a particularly large surge in publishing and the creation of political and literary reviews, many of which eventually came to review Darwin's work. There were local scientific clubs and societies, museums of curiosities, subscriptions. People could get hold of materials through subscriptions to circulating libraries. This is one that took 500 copies of The Origin of Species after it was published and made it available to its subscribers. And there were shows and exhibitions. There was a tremendous variety of ways in which people could engage with science and eventually could engage with the contents of Darwin's book as well. And lastly, I would like to mention that there was increasing prosperity for a large number of Victorians and increasing destitution for others. It's what the eventual Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, was to call two nations. The country was very much divided into the rich and the poor, the middle class and the poor. As we heard a little last week, perhaps, there was similarly a fracturing of the religious belief system. the national church, the British had a state church, the Church of England, was at that point fracturing into many dissenting sects. There were challenges to the traditional core beliefs, and to some degree there was a rise in secularization. Even within the church, there were theologians who were beginning to look critically and with an intelligent eye on the documents on which the faith was based. There were studies of the Bible, for example, as a historical document, not necessarily as something that should be taken literally, but as something that had experienced changes as it had been copied and copied and copied and sent down to the 19th century. So it was one of the most lively, interesting, and changing periods of British history. There was, if one can generalize, a very strong sense of progress, of advance, of change. And in relation to that, there was equally a great belief in science as the way forward, that there were increased audiences for science and a commitment to the idea of natural law, such as gravity, for example, or electricity. So when Darwin wrote, he was publishing in a world that we often call ready to hear him. And clearly it wasn't completely ready to hear him because there was very intense controversy. But there were many things about that Victorian context that helped individuals feel that much of what was being put forward in The Origin of Species was in some way meaningful and could even be correct. Now, in Darwin's day, he was not the only evolutionist, and it's now a very well-known thought that we shouldn't really even call it a Darwinian revolution, that much of the Darwinian revolution is not directly attributable to Darwin, and much of it isn't really a revolution. There's a lot of continuity between the thought that was around the place before Darwin wrote and many of the responses to Darwinism picked up on things that had been said before Darwin himself. So that I'd like to draw to your attention at least 3 other evolutionists whose work is well worth your regard: Herbert Spencer, the great philosopher, Robert Chambers, an interesting journalist, and Alfred Russel Wallace, who simultaneously put forward a theory of evolution by natural selection with Darwin. So, here is the book itself. If we stand back from the moment in 1859 and acknowledge that there was a strong sense of progress, that there were other people putting forward very comprehensive theories of evolutionary change, transmutation as it was called, drawing sometimes on the earlier work of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, the French evolutionist, and sometimes also drawing on ideas of historical change, that societies tend to grow and develop and advance, sometimes drawing on ideas of self-improvement. If one acknowledges all this is milling around in a wonderful ferment of ideas in the 1850s in Britain and in Europe and in North America, we have to ask ourselves, what was it that made Darwin's book so remarkable? What was it that made Darwin's book the one that has become the famous one? And it's very frequently and correctly said that Darwin was the first to suggest a workable mechanism, that of natural selection. It's very frequently said and correctly said that Darwin supplied a mountain of evidence to support his proposals. And it's assumed, and I think correctly assumed, that a good scientific theory has the ability to stand on its own feet, and its internal logic is able to persuade people of its truth. And these are all so. But science history tells us, doesn't always work like that. There's usually a great deal of criticism of new ideas. There's negotiation over the meanings of the ideas, over the words that are being used to express new concepts. And there's often very many difficulties over accepting statements that at that time might appear contrary to fact. What looks like evidence to one person may be entirely nonsensical to another. And it's not even clear, retrospectively, when a new idea might be a good idea, when it might be worth accepting. It could just be a wacko concept out on the lunatic fringe. New ideas have to come with proper credentials. They need to be discussed and evaluated. And you'll hear in future weeks from a staggering array of experts all about the clarity and success of modern evolutionary theory. But back in 1859, no one could see that. They couldn't see the future. All they could see was what Darwin was presenting, and it created a tremendous discussion, anxiety, and doubt in the minds of its readers. Why should they accept this proposal? So it takes time to bring about a revolution in thought, and the responses to Darwin's book show the full range of difficulties and the great diversity of themes that his contemporaries felt were relevant to that revolution. So I want to take you back to some of the work that went into Darwin's origin. Here is the book itself, the first edition, the first English edition, November the 24th, 1859, which we'll all, I hope, be celebrating next November. And the title page that you'll see is published by John Murray, Albemarle Street in London, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. You might be interested to hear that Darwin had a rather different title when he was consulting with his publisher that was much more elaborate. It was an abstract of an essay on the origin of species and varieties by means of natural selection. And John Murray, the publisher, said, "I'm sorry, nobody's going to understand that. We need it shorter, we need it snappier, and we need some explanation of what natural selection is." So Darwin came up with this other title, which is now the title, that I myself think is a little cumbersome. Perhaps you do too, but it was requested by the publisher. Here is Darwin. This is a mechanical reproduction of a photograph that was taken at a date that is hotly contested by Darwinists. It could be 1854, could be 1857, but it's definitely in those 5 years before The Origin of Species was published. And again, we see him as a very respectable, determined, kindly-looking figure. I want to quickly go through some of the biographical details that supported the work that went into The Origin of Species. You'll remember from 2 weeks ago that Darwin was independently wealthy and that he had no need to take any form of employment. He was able to dedicate his life to gathering the information he wanted. And so this is his home, very lovely watercolor by Albert Godwin, showing you the extent of his property. There's a little black blob down in the bottom left-hand corner, which is Darwin sitting on a chair on his veranda. So it was taken during his lifetime. He had staff. He had a large family. He had a farm that provided meat and milk for the family. He had a very large set of investments to look after, mostly in railroads at that time, so that he was a private gentleman in the traditional Victorian sense who chose to give his spare time to science. And as we know from his diaries and from many other reports from his correspondence, that he ordered his life in such a way so that he could give every moment of his time to science. He was unwell for many periods in his life, and that he worked around that illness in order to do what he wanted to do. And those of us who are sometimes feeling restricted in our own employment today, it takes quite a lot for us to think of what it must be like not to have to work and yet to want to write The Origin of Species. It's a tremendous dedication, tremendous drive, tremendous focus that Darwin expressed throughout his life. From 1836, when he arrived back on the Beagle, through to 1858, when he received that letter from Alfred Russel Wallace containing the same theory of evolution by natural selection, Darwin was constantly thinking about evolutionary theory, rethinking and reworking his thesis, his theories. His house and his garden were in many respects his laboratory and his factory. He experimented all the time. This is his record of experiments that took place from 1855 to 1867. It's just a list of plants, pigeons, all kinds of things that he was doing, salting seeds, planting things up, trying to break the constitution of various organisms, for example. We know that he very consistently ran through a breeding program with pigeons in an attempt to track some of the characteristic aboriginal markings of early pigeons. He was hoping to see them in some of the more fancy breeds that he was working with. So he experimented on pigeons that he had at home. He spent 8 years looking at barnacles, a wonderful project that is usually laughed at, even by historians, that he spent so long on such tiny organisms and with producing such a complete reassessment of their classification with nary a word of evolutionary theory in the 4 volumes that he published. But those 8 years provided him with a very remarkable example of evolution in action. And then he thought. It wasn't all just experiment and being ill. He also thought, here is a path at the end of his garden on which he would saunter or stride every day, a couple of times a day, making a circuit, 2 circuits, 3 circuits, depending on the depth of the problem that he was trying to resolve. So he thought, and he read widely, and he corresponded incessantly. Often his letters turn out to be a kind of experiment in words. He would write to people to ask them, what would happen if such and such? And they would respond. So that there are now known to be 16,000 extant letters. We reckon he probably wrote about 30,000 in his lifetime, maybe 400 a year going in and out of his house, bringing information, helping him with his researches. And here was where the work took place, in Darwin's study, the centerpiece of his home. And it's not too fanciful to think of it as the center of a research network. Darwin was very meticulous in getting his information. He would file it in the different places that you can see behind his chair. He used this room for peace and quiet, but he also used it for writing. It is the place where he wrote The Origin of Species, a powerhouse of information. And there are other elements of his biography that added to his project that I'll just quickly mention. His social respectability, the wide range of previous publications, his membership of elite scientific societies, an influential network of friends and correspondents. These too contributed materially to the book's success. And I must add as well what his son called his particular sweetness of voice, the modest, very pleasant tone of voice in which The Origin of Species is written. It's written in the first person, all the way through. You're hearing from Darwin as, I think this, I did that, I went down the garden and I explored such and such. He politely invites readers to see things his way. He sympathizes that they may find it difficult, and he confesses that he too finds it difficult. He experienced just the same difficulties. So this is a very remarkable scientific mode of address. Not many people like to put the difficulties up front, and Darwin did do that. It may have been a strategic ploy, but he nevertheless felt sincerely that there were many difficulties. This was not a complete theory. He had worked for 20 years and it was still incomplete, but he was putting it forward and he was being honest about where the gaps were. And this is one of Darwin's special gifts as a writer, that he could see the other person's point of view. Moreover, his sympathy for the natural world also helped him to think of animals and plants as part of this web of relationships, that the human being was only one species among many. And this is expressed many times in his notebooks, in his correspondence, although not so much in his printed works. And once on the Beagle voyage, he was out in a small rowing boat when a sea turtle rose up underneath. And Darwin describes in very amused terms how the turtle looked at him, he looked at the turtle, and then the turtle just turned and went away again. He was able to give animals and plants some kind of agency. He could think of them, if we're using modern terminology, he could think of them as actors in the same world as himself. And it's very neatly expressed in a remark that he made in a letter to his closest friend, Joseph Hooker, a botanist, in 1854, when they were discussing the controversy that was emerging then between two of their colleagues, Thomas Henry Huxley and Richard Owen, about the size of simian brains, the size of ape brains. And Richard Owen insisted that the chimpanzee brain was much smaller than the human brain. Darwin writes, and it's not a joke, Darwin wasn't a jokey writer, but he was a humorous writer. He writes to his friend, I wonder what a chimpanzee would say to this. So he had this great ability to think outside the box. Now, although Darwin understood the revolutionary nature of his proposals, he didn't write an aggressively revolutionary text. It was tightly woven. It was a well-structured argument. One long argument, he calls it, in the concluding chapter. Some historians have even likened it to George Eliot's great novel Middlemarch, in his ability to lace very complex threads of argument, complex storylines, and developing themes together and bring it all to a powerful conclusion. These comparisons with a novelist's technique are acknowledging that this is a text that depends on the power of words, on the power of persuasion, and needs, or at least has, a strong authorial voice. Again, it's a little bit different from the kind of science books that were being produced during its time. To read The Origin of Species, then, is to follow Darwin's line of argument almost personally. It's a very special relationship between the author and the reader that we can still feel today. So I do hope you'll take the opportunity to look at his writing and let some of that magic into your soul. So the book's great. In it, he manages to soar above his illnesses, his anxieties, his domestic situation, to write an extraordinary reformulation of the natural world. The main themes are that all organisms come to be through entirely natural processes, that there is an analogy between domesticated organisms and those in the wild, and that natural selection is the mechanism for change, a concept he derived from Thomas Robert Malthus, based on the idea of competition and struggle for survival. Only the successful survive. And he introduces a number of accessory concepts and very powerful transformative metaphors that this process of change is gradual. It only takes place little by little. And this is one of the things that was contested all the time after Darwin wrote. How could it just be little by little? It's still contested today. But this was Darwin's absolute bottom line. It was not a process that took place in large jumps. It was little by little. He introduced the idea of ancestry represented as a branching tree from the fossil to the living forms. An extraordinary metaphor that, now that it's so much part of what we think about evolution, it's very difficult to go back to a time when this was unusual. There were other ways of thinking about the fossil record in Darwin's day. It could be thought of as a ladder. It could be thought of as a bush. It could be thought of as a circle, depending on your way of understanding what was going on. It's Darwin who gives us the tree, and it was absolutely transformative. Another powerful idea was that, of course, there was no special creation, there was no design in living beings, there were only adaptations to local circumstances, and that this had a very powerful corollary that there was no necessary progression in evolutionary change. Again, this was a concept that was endlessly critiqued after he wrote. Many people found that very difficult to accept, and much of the scientific response to Darwinism was that they were keen to accept the mechanism of natural selection, but they put back into Darwin's theory this idea of progress. Darwin had taken it out absolutely. There's no necessary progress whatsoever. And in general, the style of his argument was rather new. It was accumulative. He gathered many, many examples together so that by the end of the book, you were left gasping, saying, okay, I believe you, I believe you. It was probabilistic. He wanted to say, if you accept this, then it's not such a big step to accept that, and it's not so terrible to take it one step further and to accept the rest. It's a new way of presenting a scientific argument. He invited his readers to utterly reconceptualize their ideas about the world and our human place in it. The emphasis shifts from a sense that the world is harmonious, the world is designed, we have a stable and significant place in that world. Darwin strips all this away and says that it's as great a view of the natural world as the previous one. He talks about competition, struggle, and warfare. It's very bleak in places. Now, what's not in the book is what was the subject of the most controversy afterwards. Darwin hardly anywhere refers to the creator in the Origin of Species. He provides no direct refutation of the existence of God. And it seems clear from his private writings that he believed that proposing that there were natural origins for all living beings was a different thing from proposing that God didn't exist, or from proposing atheism, or indeed from being himself atheistic. What he was doing in The Origin of Species was suggesting that the creator or the divine force, if there was one, was not involved in the production of new forms. And I think it's as well just to recapitulate that Darwin was not an atheist, and he was never an atheist. It's not clear how much he did believe in any divine force, and it's very likely that his belief system went up and down over a long lifetime. But at the time of writing The Origin of Species, retrospectively, he said that he deserved to be called a theist. So there's clearly some belief in a divine force there. And we know that he was, we know that his relationships with his wife meant that he never quite gave up a belief in some kind of other force in the universe. He just didn't like it actively working in daily life. So God isn't in The Origin of Species. It's deliberately taken out, or he is deliberately taken out. Nor are humans in The Origin of Species. Although by implication, Darwin's writing removed human beings from any divine origin. By implication, we were all animals too. And that's where all the controversies lay, in these two areas that are not in The Origin of Species, God and humans. Now, there were many valid criticisms of the book that often mentioned a number of scientific issues, the lack of transitional forms, the unusual style of his argument, uneasiness about basing a system on random changes, and problems over the origin of their variation, and indeed the timescale as well. So there were lots of significant criticisms that Darwin attempted to address in different editions, successive editions. Where's the evidence for such change? That's what he has been trying to find for 20 years, and that's what he continued to seek in the 25 years after he published. But it was the science and religion issue that dominated the controversies. They've continued to dominate our understanding of evolutionary theory ever since. This debate in 1859 was one of the first great public controversies over science and indeed over modernity. It was ultimately spread worldwide as translations and extracts of his writings circulated. It was a public controversy that was fed by the rise in different publications, different ways of getting information in the middle of the 19th century. It's one of the most astonishing examples of the dissemination of science that's available to us for analysis. We can spread the spread of this theory in great detail and see how it changed in different geographical regions, different religious contexts, different social contexts. And we can still see its power to excite controversy today. It's a tremendously interesting problem how this one theory has gone global and still is the most provocative scientific issue of the day. There were many different ways that this theory was spread. It was not just confined to people reading The Origin of Species. There were reviews, of course. There were journals and magazines that were writing about it. There were personal networks of communication. There were public speakers at meetings, mostly limited to the middle classes in the 1860s, but continuing through the 19th century. There were many caricatures and souvenir objects produced that took Darwin's views into the public sphere. There were books and articles by supporters, and there were books and articles by critics. And there were popular lectures, and there were sermons. There were many, many different ways of engaging with this issue so that it's not just reading The Origin of Species that gives you access to these controversies. And one notable aspect of the responses to The Origin of Species was the consolidation of a body of supporters. Doesn't always happen, but Darwin was incredibly lucky that he had 5, 6, or 7 really active and vigorous supporters, each of whom had particular objections to parts of his theory, but who nevertheless felt that this was an astonishing way forward, that they should be out there supporting Darwin's right to be heard and supporting the sense that this was a rational, exciting, new way of thinking about the biological world. Asa Gray on the left, Thomas Henry Huxley, the most famous supporter, Charles Lyell in the middle, who very interestingly was a tiny bit older and who had felt very much that he couldn't go the whole orang. He wrote to Huxley to say he wanted to support Darwin but couldn't go the whole orang. And a younger supporter, Ernst Haeckel, on the far right, who took Darwin's work into Germany, a very prominent young supporter in Germany. There were rather noted figures against evolutionary theory. But one of the interesting aspects of this debate is that these 3 figures, who were certainly very powerful intellectuals, never really ganged up together to create a unified attack against Darwinism. There was a unified defense supported by Darwin, but there was no unified attack. And if one's going to think in military terms, that possibly might affect some of the results through the 1860s and 1870s. Louis Agassiz, the great Bostonian natural scientist at Harvard, Richard Owen, the director of the Natural History Museum in London, and Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, not a scientist at all, but most famously engaging with Thomas Henry Huxley at a debate at the British Association meeting at Oxford in 1860, when Huxley and Owen, first of all, jousted about apes as ancestors, and then Huxley and Wilberforce, one representing science and Darwinism, the other representing the church and theological conservatism, metaphorically representing those sides, publicly argued on stage in front of a large audience such as yourself. And the historical record is a little vague on this. It's now generally thought to be the case that neither one of those 2 figures won the debate. They both liked to think they had won. They each thought they had won. And because we're now living in a world that is Darwinistic, we tend to look back at this and see Huxley as winning this debate. It was less easy to see such a conclusion at the time. Many of Bishop Wilberforce's colleagues thought that he had spoken wittily, that he had been very powerful, and that he had carried a large number of the crowd. Now, the debate moved very rapidly, just as I'm going to move very rapidly, into public discussion about the role of apes in our human ancestral tree. And this was reflected graphically, evocatively, humorously in some of the many magazines that were published after the origin in the 1860s through the 1870s. Many people were disturbed by Darwin's naturalism. If we're natural beings, what's the reason for our existence? And most of the responses, whether they were scientific or public, or scientific or non-scientific, in one way or another, took up this issue. If we're natural beings, we clearly have emerged from the apes. For many people in the 1860s, it was not emerging from the chimpanzee. The chimpanzee hardly features in these visual commentaries. Most people wished to associate ourselves by association with the gorilla, who was an organism only just introduced, or only just known in the Western world through the work of Paul du Chaillu in 1861. The gorilla becomes the icon, the emblem of human ancestry. And here is a most famous illustration from Punch magazine, a humorous magazine in England. Am I a man and a brother with a gorilla behind? The querying nature of the thing being the close relationship between humans and such apes is that they're interconvertible, that to make a commentary about human evolution is to show the human as the ape and the ape as the human. These kinds of reversals are very commonplace through the 1860s and 70s. Here is another well-known illustration of the same kind of relationship where Darwin is portrayed as an ape, showing, holding a mirror up to another ape, and the implication is that they are the mirror image of each other. Many more such illustrations, cartoons, featured in these debates. This one is from the magazine called Fun. Darwin again features as a rather, well, it's a monkey here, but it's certainly a very hairy primate. And these were not always humorous, or they were not always friendly. Here is a French cartoon that I put in just to show you that many authors and illustrators understood absolutely what Darwin was about, that his book, although it didn't refer to God, although it didn't refer to human beings, that he was attempting to break down the traditional structure of the church, and that he was proposing that human beings were completely natural objects. This is a French cartoon with the materialist philosopher Émile Maître holding up the circus hoops. He's in a circus, and Darwin is portrayed as a monkey bursting through the hoops of credulity, and he's going to leap through the second one that is labeled superstition, so that people understood what he was doing. They understood that he was a gentleman, that he was respectable, that he didn't write in such a way, but that his book, nevertheless, was a revolutionary book. So in conclusion, I just want to leave this with you. This is a very long-established statuette. It's now in reproduction, circulating. You can buy it on eBay. But this is an original and was... this is a photograph from the one that was on Lenin's desk, actually. Lenin had one. Widely distributed imagery of the ape looking at the human. So in conclusion, Darwin did change the way we thought about ourselves. Even in the months after The Origin was published, people knew that this was underway. This was what they were being invited to rethink our place in the natural world. It was a very powerful restructuring that contributed enormously to the making of the modern world. Few individuals reach such heights of intellectual endeavor or have their views discussed so widely and with such vigor, with such venom, with such enthusiasm. Even if people didn't think that they were descended from apes, they talked about it constantly, and we still do. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that just truly engaging and I lost all track of the time. I don't know about the rest of you, but I just was almost transfixed. That was delightful. We now turn to the panel discussion format. Our first discussant is Professor Craig Heller, the Laurie Loki Business Wire Professor of Biology and the Steer University Fellow at Stanford. Professor Heller's research includes the neurobiology of sleep, circadian rhythms, regulation of human body temperature, mammalian hibernation, and human exercise physiology. Professor Heller is co-director of the Center for Sleep and Circadian Neurobiology. The center fosters multidisciplinary approaches and collaborations to increase the understanding of the neural mechanisms controlling arousal states and arousal transitions, the function of sleep, the neural mechanisms of circadian rhythms. His research on human exercise physiology focuses on the effects of body temperature on physical conditioning and performance and is truly interesting. Professor Heller teaches courses at Stanford on physiology, neurobiology, sleep, and biological clocks, a champion of undergraduate education in biology and in human biology. Professor Heller has played, little known to most undergraduates, a major role in shaping undergraduate participation in research at Stanford. Craig.
Thanks, Bill. And thank you, Janet, for that wonderful lecture. It was just spellbinding. What I'd like to comment on is something that Janet certainly touched upon in her talk and brings out beautifully in her book. I'm sure you've all read it now. You do your reading assignments before you come to class, right? And what that is quality of mind of this man. If you think about Darwin as the old geezer with the flowing white beard and hair and the black cape and looking under these heavy eyebrows, it's not hard to imagine that this is a really intelligent guy and he's done a lot of hard brain work. But if you think back to the time when he actually was actively engaged in formulating his ideas, gathering the evidence, I think you have to be absolutely astounded that this young person accomplished as much as he did under the circumstances that he did. When he left on the Beagle, he had just graduated with his Bachelor of Arts degree from Cambridge. He tried medical school when he was 16 years old, and that didn't quite work out. And then he went to Cambridge with the idea that he would become a preacher one day. His undergraduate days were not terribly remarkable. He was like a typical undergraduate here. He spent a lot of time partying, playing cards. He liked to be on the out of doors, collecting insects, bugs, and things like that.
Especially beetles.
Especially beetles. But what was remarkable was the fact that when the opportunity came to go on the voyage of the Beagle with no additional training, with no mentors along with him, he spent 5 years creating the most incredible wealth of knowledge, observations, collections that later would serve him well in his efforts to understand the origin of species. So when he gets back from this 5-year voyage, and you think about it, what an adventure for a young man who is essentially the same age as our graduate students today. Think about his hiking in the Andes, climbing up to the high Andes. Most of our young people would be so fascinated with scaling that tough cliff that's right over there. But what was Darwin doing? Probably was doing that too, but he was collecting mollusk shells and wondering how mollusk shells could get to the top of the Andes. Think about him in the South Pacific on coral atoll islands. Now, the surfboard hadn't been invented yet, but I can sure he could have found many things to do on these beautiful beaches. Instead, he's wondering about how in the world you could generate a coral island when corals can't live below the depth to which light can penetrate the water. Similarly, in the rainforest, fascinating diversity of animals and plants, and he's collecting spiders and beetles. So the actual activities during the voyage of the Beagle essentially shows a quality of mind that is absolutely exceptional. He certainly would be a first-rate graduate student today. Okay, so he comes back. He's 27 years old. This is now the equivalent of, let's say, he's 27 years old. He comes back, and he's now essentially the equivalent of a postdoctoral fellow. Okay? So think of the voyage of the Beagle as his graduate work, if we put it in the context of today. No mentors, no teachers, he's self-educated on this incredible voyage. So he comes back, he's the equivalent of a postdoctoral fellow. So what does he do over the period of time that a normal postdoctoral fellow today would spend in the lab of a mentor? He's not in the lab of a mentor. He sets himself up and he goes to work. Well, over this period of time, he writes the zoological record of the beagle. Now, he's really the editor of this. It's 5 volumes, but yet, as Janet had mentioned, he is the central network for the accumulation of all of the information. He's getting people to comment on the collections, and he's gathering that information and putting it together and making sense of it. 5 volumes. He also writes The Voyage of the Beagle, which we all know is probably the best-selling travel book of all times, but a wonderful book. He writes a book about breeding of domesticated plants and animals. And he writes that book about coral reefs, which is quite remarkable because science in that day was not characterized by formulating hypotheses and testing hypotheses, which characterizes science today. But that's what he did in his analysis of coral islands. He said, well, here's an island in the middle of the ocean. Coral, it's made out of coral. Corals can't grow below the light zone, but yet the water here is very deep. So how in the world could this island come to be? Well, there must have been some other eminence here, like a volcano, that has subsequently sunk. Well, the idea that a volcano could form and sink, of course, came to him because he was under the influence of Lyell's ideas that the Earth was much, much older than had been accepted at the time. Okay, but the record for this guy as a postdoctoral fellow, 8 books and 16 articles. Okay, do you think he could have gotten a job today? Okay, what's the next stage? The next stage is the equivalent of our assistant professor. He continues to be extremely productive. He focuses a lot on geology. He writes the geology of volcanic islands. He writes another book about the geology of South America. And then he starts this work on barnacles. And he writes 3 volumes on barnacles, which Janet mentioned. And in addition to these 5 books, he, in addition, writes 35 articles. Do you think he could have gotten tenure? So the point is that this guy really, really had incredible quality of mind, industriousness, and all of this work is non-trivial. And it spans an enormous range of topics. Okay, where did the big idea come from? The big idea began with a notebook that he opened in 1837, which was just when he came back from the Voyage of the Beagle. So these ideas are incubating over this long period of time that he's doing work on all of these other specific organisms. Okay, so as Janet mentioned, the publication in 1859, and at that point, I guess we would say he'd be well into his years as a full professor. So he's now halfway through his professional career, so what comes next? Certainly continued productivity, extremely wide-ranging, all the way from books on vegetable molds to books on animal behavior to books on human evolution. Throughout all of his career, he's just endlessly curious, endlessly observant, and questioning, always questioning. So the second half of his professional career brings another quality of mind to the fore, and that is behavior under fire. And fire can come in 2 different ways. It can come from enemies, and it can come from friends. And Darwin dealt with both extremely well. First of all, with enemies. He avoided emotional confrontation. He stayed above the fray. He depended, as Janet pointed out, on his cadre of strong supporters, friends, to make the arguments for him. And he did not get engaged or bring himself down into the fray of the nitty-gritty of arguing about his ideas. Instead, he worked steadily to shore up those ideas. He continued to work. He continued to write papers and books and letters, as Janet pointed out, always working to change the minds of individuals who wanted to agree with him or those who didn't agree with him or those who had questions. So he continued to build a very strong scientific foundation. But what about friends? Well, he fostered very good relationships. He fostered collaborations. He was always willing to share credit and generously acknowledge the contribution of others. But he never really tried to bring the spotlight onto himself. He was always very pleased to stay on the sidelines and just continue to build his strong foundation for his argument. So what's the problem of dealing with friends? The problem is that you may have a really good idea, and you may think it's very, very clear, and you may think that the next steps are quite obvious. Your friends are very supportive, but they make a hash out of it. They also want to interpret your idea in their way. They want to see it through their eyes. They want to actually use it for some agenda that they may have. So Asa Gray, which was pointed out, was certainly a friend, but also he twisted the ideas of natural selection to fit his own background. Okay, so essentially, all I wanted to say is that if you were a working scientist today, or you're a student hoping to be a working scientist, just be ready to encounter resistance, both from enemies who are disagreeing with what you have to offer, but also from your friends who may want to interpret it and use it in different ways. As scientists, we are always building on the foundation that others have prepared for us. But we have to keep in mind that someone else is going to be building the floor above us. And hopefully some of the students that we have today are going to be our apprentices that are going to be working on those floors above us. And boy, if we can have just a few with the quality of mind of Darwin, we'll be doing well. Thanks.
Our second discussant this evening is Professor Robert Proctor, Professor of the History of Science in the History Department, having received his PhD from Harvard in the History of Science and his undergraduate degree from Indiana University in Biology. Professor Proctor's current work focuses on the history of scientific controversy, especially in the 20th and 21st century science and medicine. He also works on the history of tobacco, the history of Nazi science, of expert witnessing, of evolution and human origins, of geology and gemstone aesthetics, and the cultural production of ignorance. His website reports that he's working on a book called Darwin in the History of Life. He teaches an undergraduate course by the same title, arguing that the 19th century evolution revolution can be seen as an effort to historicize life. He's also finishing a book on the history of the lapidary art called Agadize, and a book on changing interpretations of the oldest tools. At Stanford, he teaches courses in the history of science, on tobacco and health in world history, and biology and social issues, among others. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Bill. What a pleasure to be here with my colleague, Janet Browne, who I've admired for so many years. And I would recommend that you read not just her short book, but her longer books, her 2 volumes, beautiful, among the most beautiful examples, I think, of science writing that you'll ever find. I'm one of those people who do not think that natural selection was Darwin's greatest achievement. I believe that Darwin's greatest achievement was showing the unity of life in a particular way, actually a way that shows the profound conservatism of life. It's really first with Darwin. You get the recognition that all cells derive probably from some original cell. And this was an idea that was never broached before. Lamarckian evolution is really strictly of parallel paths. Humans do not share a common ancestor with apes. For Darwin. In a sense, there's spontaneous generation everywhere, and then all life is striving for perfection. And it's sort of the same idea that in Lamarck's form that leads to this idea that, in a way, gorillas are sort of imperfect, striving humans. And 100 years ago, you had this notion that there's something profoundly wrong with gorillas. But Darwin shows this continuity of life, and I agree very much with Janet that this notion of a tree is extremely important, a tree of life, and interestingly one that goes still vertical as opposed to the genetics one which actually goes downward. If you look at the origins of tree metaphors, there are earlier versions of looking at how things change over time, diversification with sort of a vertical axis. One is linguistics, the discovery of Indo-European language families, that is a tree branching process. The science of stematics, which is the science of trying to find the original text. All of these are developed before Darwin, by the way, and use the same historical genealogical tree form, but also genealogies themselves. And Darwin put these together and applied them to life, and for the first time made life a historical process which, again, all things are connected through genealogy to each other, and that had not been done before. It's an interesting puzzle that Janet mentioned as to why Darwin so resonates today. I mean, as an intellectual figure, I think he's even different from someone like Einstein. Einstein's a genius, but ordinary people, for one thing, find it hard to grasp Einstein. And ordinary people don't argue about Einstein, but ordinary people do argue about Darwin. Darwin touches us in a way that I think is different in a way from almost every other scientist. Our sense of self, our sense of who we are in the world, where we've come, our relatedness to the rest of the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom too. Darwin is different in that sense and generates resistance. I always ask the freshmen in my World History of Science course if you are convinced that humans share a common ancestor with apes, and I think some of my former students here are in this room, and we always find that between 10 and 20% of Stanford undergraduates are creationists in this sense and are not convinced that humans share a common ancestor with apes. I also asked them if they're convinced that humans share a common ancestor with the California banana slug, and I get about the same thing. And then I also ask if they're convinced that humans share a common ancestor with Vice President Dick Cheney, and you actually get an entirely different set of what I call Democrat creationists. And by the way, the same was true when I taught, except for the Cheney part, at Harvard in the biology department, that typically between 10 and 20% of the Harvard biology majors were creationists. And of course, the problem is one that's large at the political level, and it's not randomly distributed. The surveys show that about 65% of all members of the Republican Party are creationists, do not believe in common ancestry of humans and apes. And it may even be true that some of our vice presidential candidates may not hold some of these same ideas. That would have to be further investigated as to whether they believe in the rapture or something like this. That was a question that unfortunately was not asked at the recent debates. Well, why is there this resistance? And I think the basic reason, and I say this based on the fact that I have an entire side of my family which is Republican, creationist racists in southern Texas. And I say that there's this resistance because many religious people think evolution really is filthy. They really think it is filthy. And why do they think this? And what is filthy about evolution in their view? And I think it's very important to realize this, of course, changes over time. And that in the Scopes trial in the 1920s, Americans thought that evolution basically would involve race mixing. And I think this is actually a difference between England and America. If you look at the United States, around the time of the forming of the fundamentals and the fundamentalist movement and the Scopes trial, you find a tremendous literature of what was called pre-Adamism, this sort of view that African Americans were created on the fifth day of creation and were beasts of the field. If you read the 1900 book, The Negro Beast, sold tens of thousands of copies published by a Baptist society. This was the view that if you believe in evolution, you believe that whites have emerged in a sense from blacks, that you basically think that white women are having sex with black men. And this was anathema. So if you look at the Ku Klux Klan theoretical literature, which is not entirely an oxymoron, you actually find that there was this exact same discussion, the same as my relatives in Texas. They thought that evolution was filthy because it involved racial miscegenation. In other words, Janet made this wonderful point about the human as ape, the ape as human, but there was also this same issue on race in the United States. In the United States, the ape was Negro. For large numbers of people, the Negro was an ape. And this played into this southern resistance to evolution. Well, what about later then? I think now if you look at creationism, one of the things, the reason that creationists think evolution is filthy today is they're basically no longer thinking race mixing. They're thinking homosexuality and abortion. That if you are an evolutionist, you think that there is no difference between man and beast. You will kill your unborn child. You will lie with the beast. Man will lie with man. Woman with woman. I think this is what is going on in terms of the present day creationist ideological opposition to Darwin. They think it is filthy because it leads to homosexuality, bestiality, immorality, materialism, and so forth. Darwin, in this sense, is an abomination. And in fact, the recent strategy of the creation research Institute, another oxymoron from Southern California, which has 750 PhD members, by the way, and is definitely worth a trip down there, by the way, quite an exciting thing. You can go down there and see how creationism is being franchised into the Islamic world in an amazing sort of Iberian bureaucratic ideological transfer. But you can also see that they've discovered a new way to attack evolution in recent years, which is to try to say that Darwin basically caused the Holocaust. Consistent with, this is becoming one of their, and I started noticing this because I used to give a lot of lectures on the history of Nazism, and I started seeing more and more people raising their hands and say, it's social Darwinism, that's what led to the Holocaust, right? Darwin led straight to Hitler. And this is becoming one of the dominant views of the creationist movement today. Okay, well, just one other little tidbit I'll give you from sort of some of the surveys I ask about creationism in my classes. One thing that's interesting is women, at least at Stanford, among the undergraduates, tend much less likely to be creationists than men. Republicans tend to be much more creationist than Democrats, as you'd predict. In fact, in my classes, it's a ratio of 5 to 1. In other words, Republicans are 5 times more likely to be creationists. And one of the things I do that we were talking over dinner is I actually survey a large number of sort of factual questions about science, and there's always a consistent greater presence of ignorance among creationists about science in general. And then I show the histogram to the students themselves, and by shaming them in this way, showing them the high correlation between creationism and ignorance, it actually causes a substantial drop in the fraction of creationists. And it never goes to 0, but it does go down to around 4%, which is actually some of the lowest I've ever seen. And also an interesting fact is I also ask them if they tend to be techies or fuzzies, And what's interesting is that the fuzzies, the humanists, it's the humanists among us who tend to be the least likely to be creationists. And it's much more the engineers and the technical people who tend to be creationists. That was true where I used to teach at Penn State, where there were actually at least 3 confirmed young Earth creationist professors with tenure on the faculty. They were, and all engineers, I might say. And the general point I would end with on this theme is that is how we have to understand Darwin's accomplishment. Darwin, I believe, was a historian of the world. He historicized the world. He showed the historical continuity and linkage of all organisms on Earth. But not only that, I think it's actually an error of history, a failure of the historical imagination and historical skill that leads to the persistence of creationism. The creationism is a failure, in a sense, of the interpretive arts. It's a failure to realize that texts are not always meant to be taken literally, that there are texts that are meant to be taken metaphorically. And it's this excessive literalism, rather than merely a mistake of technicality, that leads to this grand misinterpretation of failing to realize the Darwinian revolution for the significance that it in fact had.
Thank you, Robert. So, Janet, would you like to reply? We'll take questions, so please bring your question to the mic. Would you like to reply to our 2 commentators?
I haven't been taking notes. So I'm afraid I would rather not reply, except to respond that both of our commentators have opened up some very interesting areas for questioning. The biographical on the one hand, and the astonishing powers of mind that Darwin presented, and the more modern consequences of how the Darwinian moment is being rethought through in the creationist and evolutionist debates today. So I would just like to thank them both, not to comment any further, and open to questions.
Well, let me just ask if you agree with Bob's interpretation of the resistance, that evolution is a kind of a filthy theory. Does that work for you?
I haven't thought of it as a filthy theory, but as Bob was speaking, I thought, yes, that's kind of ringing true, because I've been working in the same way of line of thought, that the rise in fundamentalist thought and creationist thought, which is not always the same, that one can see about us today seems, of course, much larger than just being related to evolutionary theory. It almost seems that the people who are espousing such views are wanting to say something about what they imagine to be the collapse of the Western world, the collapse of morality, the rising divorce rate, the increasing numbers of illegitimate children. They're wanting to say much more than evolution. And it's science, I think, that is being regarded as the cause of this, the rationality, the secularism, the materialism that the scientific mindset encourages in particular people. So I'm actually coming at the same position, but from a slightly different and even more stressful perspective.
Thank you. Sir.
I'm curious about the publisher. Was there any hesitancy or concern or difficulty about getting these ideas published?
Darwin's publisher was known in that period as being a remarkably forward-looking, liberal publisher who did put forward a lot of scientific texts. Nevertheless, he himself was a believer and did feel anxious about the contents of the book. He sent it out to be refereed, and the referee suggested very strongly that this book should not be published. It was a waste of time. It was all about pigeons. It was not a book to publish. But John Murray went forward with it. So he staked his reputation on publishing and, as it happened, had a very profitable relationship with Darwin thereafter. So as a publisher, as a commercial decision, he took the right decision. As an individual believer, he wasn't so happy with the book's contents.
Thank you.
John.
Thank you for visiting us at Stanford this week and for your superb book, your biography, which I think of both as a scholarly work of excellence, but also as beautifully written. So thank you for that. I'd like to ask if you could speak a little bit more about Darwin's relationship with his wife, Emma. How would you characterize that relationship? And in particular, how did that relationship influence the development of his theory and its publication or the delay in publication? And the other way around, how did the theory, as it developed in his mind, influence their relationship?
Well, thank you for the question. You know, that opens up a whole can of worms in historical studies, because there's a wide range of views, not so much about the relationship between Darwin and his wife. It's consistently and has been consistently understood that they had a very warm and loving relationship. There's no question about that. It's how historians interpret the known facts about his wife's religiosity and Darwin's presumed secularity or secularism. And those of a rather more dramatic bent than me like to see that as creating conflict in the home. Anxiety on his wife's part that she wouldn't meet Darwin in heaven after they died, that he had many doubts that would send him to hell, actually. And then there are people like me who feel, and also I've had the advantage of reading a lot of her correspondence with her children, that she wasn't a policeman in that kind of way, that Darwin was very sensitive to her beliefs, and didn't want to hurt her, but that he had this book that he was going to publish. And they discussed it together. She read the proofs, so that it was not withheld or delayed in any way by her feelings about Christianity.
Sir.
Most of the people here are Californians, have hiked and walked in the Evolution Valley and in the Sierra and looked at the peaks around there, Darwin, Lyell, Huxley, and Wallace.
And
So Wallace is ranked up with them. Would you talk a little bit more about Wallace and his role? You mentioned him as writing Darwin a letter, but was he just was he almost as good, or was there some evolutionary thing going on that let Darwin sort of triumph over Wallace? Because some people think it was almost equal. What do you think?
Well, I think Wallace was the most wonderful thinker, innovative and extraordinary, even more extraordinary in a way than Darwin, because he was coming at the same ideas from a much less educated background. He was entirely self-taught and had not any of the advantages of Darwin's university education, Darwin's private income, Darwin's travels. Wallace's travels were undertaken in order to collect specimens to sell, so that he could both pursue natural history and earn his own living. So there's many differences between them. And yet Wallace, in a stroke of genius, in the space of 4 years, goes from point 0 to point 10 and has come up with a theory of evolution by natural selection that he writes out in 2 days flat and sends, by coincidence, to the one person who he knows might be interested, which is Charles Darwin. And so I just think Wallace is the most wonderful man, and that it's very important we should remember him.
Well, I might just add to that, he is a socialist as well. He was a spiritualist. He's involved in seances. He's a feminist. I mean, he's distinct in many different ways that make him more interesting. But it seems to me that he's not the match for Darwin. I mean, he comes up with natural selection, but he doesn't have the massive sort of accumulative stuff that Janet talked about. And so I think, in a way, it was sort of odd that Darwin was willing to grant sort of priority, even for a moment, to Wallace, because it seems to me Darwin is really the more outstanding figure.
Well, when you say outstanding, are you thinking of the evidentiary basis that he's got? Are you thinking of his quizzical mind and approach? What is it that made Darwin so outstanding?
Well, as Janet would say, I think it's the massive fossil. I mean, here you have not just the greatest biologist of the century, but one of the greatest geologists of the century is Darwin. You can't really say that about Wallace. There's nothing like the theory of coral reefs that Darwin developed that would be comparable for. I mean, Darwin, probably would have won about 10 Nobel Prizes if it had existed, and Wallace might have won maybe one.
Sir.
For me, one of the breathtaking moments of The Origin of Species was the place where Darwin identified the taxonomic tree with the tree of the historical development of species. That it clinches his argument and puts everything in a perfect clarity. Now, we've been told in the first lecture about Darwin's writing of the tree in his notebook, and we know from his work on barnacles that he himself did taxonomic work. When did he come up with that insight of the identity of those two trees?
Well, the only thing I would say is that the tree metaphor the tree drawing, actually the first evolutionary tree is in his very first evolutionary notebooks from 1837, where, interestingly, it's not just a vertical tree, but it's actually more like the wosa, the tree of, the whole tree of life that we have now. It was of a multi-directional tree, which is actually much more interesting and consistent with what Janet was talking about, his questioning of progress, which I don't entirely agree with, because I think Darwin was actually goes back and forth on this, and actually there is one point where he has a very revealing passage in The Origin where he talks about if animals from one period in geological history were to come back into a previous period in geological history, they would dominate those creatures because later creatures can dominate earlier creatures. That's almost certainly not true. If you had T-Rexes, if you ignore humans, but if T-Rexes were somehow to come back, they would certainly dominate. Nothing has sort of improved on that score.
But as I understood the question, it wasn't where did the tree come from, it was Darwin came to realize that some of his best evidence was the Linnaean system of classification. And it was, is that not the case, that you were asking about when did Darwin come up with the idea that the Linnaean system, the Systema Naturae, the natural hierarchical system of classification, independently invented by Linnaeus in 1759, published in 1759, that Darwin said, I can give you an explanation for the hierarchical clustering of life. And the question I thought was, when did Darwin first realize that?
Well, I would say that's very clear very on. I think the more important point in a way is that Darwin is anti-Linnaean. He's saying that taxonomy, we really have to de-emphasize taxonomy, and that he agreed with Lamarck that species are human artifacts, they're constructs, that really we're talking about the continuity of life, and he was not so interested in taxonomy per se. I mean, really, Linnaeus had solved that problem in a sense. What Darwin simply does is make the abstract Aristotelian taxonomic tree of Linnaeus, and there were many abstract logical trees of fevers, for example, and trees of logical arguments. He turned that into an actual historical tree where the trunk is older than the tips of the branches. He also actually uses a coral metaphor, not simply a tree, but a coral. And he says this is a more realistic metaphor because only the tips are alive, the trunk is dead, and everything that's come before is extinct. But I think his recognition that this branching phenomenon as an abstract tree that Linnaeus had worked out, and even earlier people than Linnaeus, was already recognized basically by everyone, and Darwin simply turned that tree into a historical tree very, very early on.
Go ahead.
Hi there. I am really interested in the idea of the creationist movement as a backlash against modern science, and I was wondering whether you could comment on the future of that movement and whether you think it will decrease or increase in strength as the time progresses, basically, and whether there's any hope for reconciliation between religion and science, at least in the United States, in the future.
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, isn't it? It's the classic problem of liberalism, that in a liberal world, one wishes to allow everybody to have their point of view, and what you do then when those people with points of view it doesn't coincide with your own point of view. And so I think scientists are in a cleft stick, in a way. All they can do is to continue producing more and more information to make what they do more accessible, perhaps, more public education, more... I think it's probably not wise to carry on contesting cases in court, because that makes, forgive me for those of you who are fundamentalists, I'm trying hard not to sound prejudiced. By bringing these cases to court, it makes it seem as if it's a real kind of argument, that it's a real alternative. And I myself believe it isn't much of one, but the courts are liberal. They have to allow different points of view. So I think it's a very complex issue. And I myself, I'm not a scientist, nor am I a sociologist of science. I don't know where science can go, except to carry on doing what it's doing. Maybe you would like to say something, Craig?
Well, I think this is the fundamental distinction between religion or philosophy and science. In science, we argue from evidence, and unless you can test something, unless you can hope to disprove a hypothesis, you're really out of your element. So you cannot take a hypothesis on faith. You cannot accept a theory because you want it to be true. Quite to the contrary, you have to be willing as a scientist to accept even your fondest hypothesis, your fondest idea is absolutely wrong. And you have to try to prove that you're wrong.
I can't resist the temptation with Janet Browne, leading biographer of Darwin, with us to ask about Darwin's illness. So, Janet, what from reading all the correspondence and looking really closely into Darwin's life, what can you tell us about Darwin's illness?
Well, there's the long answer and the short answer. That he was no iller than many, many of his friends and relatives and colleagues and other people in 19th century Britain. Stomach complaints, dyspepsia, nervous headaches, tremblings, giddiness, all the symptoms that Darwin describes were symptoms that medical historians see recorded in correspondence throughout the 19th century. So we could either make a particular case that Darwin was special in some way and that all these symptoms came together in one particular malady, or we could say that he suffered from a number of complaints, many of which were rather commonplace, that maybe he had some kind of self-inflicted poisoning from too many mercury-based drugs, for instance, potions, pills, various things that were given for digestive disorders actually had a lot of mercurous chloride in them. So he could have been self-poisoning to some extent. He could have had a duodenal ulcer. He could have had a touch of typhoid. He could have had some kind of bacterial infection in his duodenum. There's all kinds of gastric problems that would have given rise to those complaints. But, and this is the long answer, it's so difficult to resist the temptation that there was considerable psychosomatic anxiety, considerable stress from the work that he was doing. It's been proposed that Darwin was worried that he was metaphorically slaying the creator, that this expressed itself through his body. There's all kinds of versions of this psychosomatic argument. And my own view, which is one of compromise because I'm British, is that it's a combination of these things. But that's not a sexy answer. So I'm very sorry that he had lots of things wrong with him.
Darwin loved cigarettes. I wonder if you could say when he started smoking, because I have a theory that he actually died of smoking.
The one that I've seen most recently that triggered my imagination is that he had lactose malabsorption.
Could have done. Have you heard the middle ear infection one? That was the giddiness. The nicotine poisoning, or certainly a variant, I mean, he may well have had cancer because they didn't have the internal diagnostic techniques that we have nowadays. He began smoking as an undergraduate and continued rather extensively during the Beagle voyage, where he had access to very strong and very different forms of cigarettes, little cigarillos that he smoked when he was in Argentina. And then when he came home and married, the cigarettes were a little less socially agreeable. He did smoke 3 cigarettes a day, we know, but he also took snuff in between. So there was a lot of nicotine going into that body. Thank you. That's very relevant.
Janet, why do you think he delegated so much of the debate and the public scene and the public life about the public debate on his argument to the likes of Huxley and other friends that you mentioned, his supporters, his defenders? Why was Darwin content to sort of step back and stay in his study working?
Well, if we had a Huxley come along and say, that's a great theory, and then go out and start defending you, Huxley was a wonderful speaker, a wonderful public figure, that Darwin understood very quickly that he was not that kind of man, that Huxley could do things, was going places, was vigorous, and loved to fight. These were things that Darwin simply didn't enjoy doing and knew he would not do well. So yes, he encouraged Huxley. Perhaps we better leave it at there. I mean, he had a number of friends who felt that they could do for this theory things that Darwin himself was not prepared to do. Now, that the theory they took out with them onto the public platforms was not always precisely Darwin's theory, and Darwin was behind them all the time, writing letters, congratulating them, thanking them, mentioning that they might have said this, or they didn't quite get that right. But very generally speaking, he was not, he didn't retreat quite as much as the books tend to say. He was there, but he was there by correspondence. I think that's the important thing that we need to take away with us tonight. He was present all the time, reading reviews, commenting, writing letters, nudging, thanking, and he was there also almost like a puppet master, helping his friends forward.
So if you have a pit bull, use it, lipstick or not.
Another question.
I know I've already asked you this question, Professor Durham, but I'm really fascinated by how he got all of his specimens home and the process that he used to preserve them and what ended up happening with all those specimens. Can you just maybe talk a little bit about that process of how he could store all these animals on this boat?
Well, actually, he did ship many, many things home, and they resulted in publications even while he was still on the Beagle. Birds, mammals are skinned. The skins are prepared and stuffed. Bones, of course, are dried and prepared for shipment. And then many of the invertebrates he put in spirits, so in alcohol. And then whenever, back in those days, a ship would meet another ship homeward bound, they would take mail and whatever was being sent back.
And are those
So he was
specimens-
actually famous by the time he got back to England because of the things that he had sent back while he was on board the Beagle.
And are they still in existence somewhere?
Oh, yes, yes.
Is that what I told you? Sue.
I had a question about his children. I know he had a number of them, and I was wondering if any of them particularly influenced his thinking or carried his torch, or kind of what happened to his offspring, as they say.
May I take that?
Yes, absolutely.
It's a great question. Thank you. He had 10 children, of whom 3 died in two very young and 1 as a 10-year-old. So there were 7 who grew up to become eminent in various ways. 3 of them became well-known figures around Cambridge University. 1 was the professor of astronomy, George Darwin. 1 was professor of botany, Frank Darwin. And 1 was Horace, who was the director of the Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company. So they all carried on the scientific torch. His 2 daughters, 1 married, Henrietta Litchfield, and she became quite a literary figure. She wrote a number of biographical studies, including that of her mother. And the other remained at home, and there's not very much documentation about her, but she seems to have been very slightly unable to live on her own, so that she stayed at home and did not marry. And the one I particularly would like to mention is Leonard Darwin, not the youngest, the second youngest, who became a very noted eugenical thinker and was president of the British Eugenics Society. He carried his father's work to places where I think Charles Darwin would have been a little reluctant to take it. But Leonard was very close with Francis Galton, the most significant eugenical thinker in the early years of the 20th century. And
hasn't Leonard been taken as evidence that intelligence is not inherited?
The eugenic The Eugenics Society was very keen on producing pedigree charts with inherited traits, of which genius was one that they were most concerned in mapping. And the Darwin-Wedgwood-Galton pedigree chart includes Leonard down at the bottom as one of the more eminent members.
Any remaining questions for the evening? This is a wonderful opportunity. We have just another minute. If not, let me remind you to sign up for lunch next week. Join us for lunch tomorrow. And a special thanks both to our panelists and to Dr. Janet Browne for coming.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.